Alright guys, so I thought today I'd just be bush hogging and not really have anything to make a video about, but luckily for y'all, I broke my chain guard. This chain guard essentially is supposed to go up like that, so when those blades try to throw something big out, it'll hit them chains and knock it down toward the ground instead of slinging it way through there. And believe me, a bush hog can sling something a long way. So today I'm going to show you guys how to weld. This is just a little Miller multi-function welder. It can do the MIG welding or my favorite, stick welding, which is convenient because you don't need gas. You can do it out in the woods or essentially the job site. It's extremely portable. This particular power supply, it's a little Multimatic 215, can run on regular 120, or it's got a separate plug that can do, I think, 220 or 240 volts. So this right here just plugs right into a regular wall outlet, or you can run it off of like a little Honda generator, whichever is handy, so you don't have to buy a great big, you know, Miller Bobcat 250 or anything to do this kind of stuff. This little welder is great on 1/4 inch material, something about this thick or that, you know. You're not going to be able to penetrate much more than that as far as just welding straight across a plate. But what I'm going to do is take the grinder. I'm going to clean this up really well in a couple of spots, and then I'm going to use the excavator to push this bar back in. I'll make some tacks, and as I push it in, I'll put a tack, push it a little more, tack, and just work my way back across to get this thing fastened back. And we'll kind of go over just very basic fundamentals of welding, just to give you guys an idea of how to do it to get you started, and should be fun. So we'll get started on this one. All right, step number one is actually a safety thing. The first thing we want to do is remove any flammable stuff from a flat surface of this machine, which it could be grass, you know, the briars, all this stuff's extremely flammable. So I'm going to wipe as much of that away as I can, and I'm also going to have my little trusty fire extinguisher. They're all different. Before you start welding on this, you know, have your fire extinguisher. You can have a water hose, that'll work, but if it is a fire extinguisher, make sure that it's in the green. These things do lose a charge. This particular fire extinguisher, you know, you can press all day and it won't work. You have to press up, pull this little latch back, and then once that little lock is out of the way, you can press down on this and really hose it down. So familiarize yourself with your fire extinguisher. And to use this, you just turn it on, simple process, and just rub it essentially on the area where you're actually going to be welding. And you can see how it turns that metal shiny. That's what you want. And a good way to pick where you're going to weld at is actually look at spots that were welded previously. Those spots are naturally going to butt up together better than trying to start over with a fresh spot. So I'm going to finish grinding because it's going to be easier with two hands, and then we'll work on getting these pieces put together. Well, that sun is bright today. I mean, it's hot. I'm trying to keep the sun behind you guys so you can see. All right, this clamp right here, bare metal, that's your ground clamp. It goes to the negative terminal on your supply. Your supply is essentially your welder, your welding machine. Okay, ground goes to negative when you're stick welding. I'm not going to go into all the other processes because if you are just trying to learn, it'll just confuse you beyond belief. So, bare metal, ground clamp, that's your negative. This is your, what most welders call a stinger, or your electrode holder. It clamps your rod in there. It's completely protected. You're not going to touch any bare metal with this one. And it goes to the positive connection on your supply marked with a positive or a plus sign. Okay, I've already ground a good connection to my workpiece right here. When you're welding on something like this, you can tell that this guard is actually bolted to this. You want your ground clamp to go directly to the piece you're working on, not what it's bolted to. So you take your ground clamp, and preferably these copper ends, you want to clamp them directly on to that bare metal that you just ground. If you clamp it on to a painted surface or a heavily rusted surface, you're either not going to be able to strike an arc at all, or you're going to hear a lot of sparking coming from around this because it's trying to make that connection. So simple, copper, clamp directly onto bare metal. Next step will be putting the electrode in your stinger. Let me get you guys set up here best I can. Try to keep that glare to a minimum. Alright, let me grab an electrode here. Alright, for the beginning welder, the best way I can describe these, the most common is like 60-10, 60-13. That's a good starting rod because your workpiece doesn't have to be perfectly clean. It can be a little bit rusty. The 60-10s or the 60-13s are just a good all around, all position electrode. These electrodes, this is a 3/32 inch. It looks a lot like a sparkler, and when you're welding, it acts just like a sparkler. The end of the electrode is bare, and essentially the way you're going to use this rod is you have your workpiece and you're just going to strike it just like you're striking a match. As soon as you strike, it'll just kind of make almost like a flaring sound is the best way I can describe it. And depending on the type of rod, I won't try to go into too much detail. You can either use a pull or a push. Now, this is where practice comes in. This is a consumable. It actually burns down, and essentially the way a welder works is it's a machine, it's like a transformer that's made to short circuit. And if you did a welding process in slow motion, you would hear pops. And essentially what is happening is there's an arc, which is a little gap between the rod and the workpiece. Each time you hear that pop, there's a molten little droplet of metal coming off the end of this rod, and it's going into the workpiece where there's a puddle. And that's where spatter comes from. When that little ball of molten rod essentially hits that puddle, it splashes, and that's where the spatter comes from. That's where you hear about sparks and stuff happening. One thing you want to do is have, and you'll be able to see this with your welding hood on, you'll be able to see this rod burning down. So as you are welding into that workpiece, you've got to feed that rod into it as you move. And the only way you get good at that is practice. The best thing I can say is go to Lowe's. They sell, you know, hot rolled, cold rolled, little, just like maybe 1 by 3 inch strips, 3 feet long. Get you some rods and just run beads. Practice running beads down this thing, and you'll be able to see the power of this little rod. It'll actually take a flat piece of metal and it'll turn it into a banana. That weld will heat that metal up and it'll tighten up, and it'll actually warp metal. So let's get right to doing some welding. You know, it's not something y'all are gonna be able to see. I don't have a lens for the camera, but I'm giving you the idea, you know, of the fundamentals. So let's get the machine set up and do a little welding. All right, I know you guys can just barely see this. There's a bad glare today, but this little welder is great for the beginning welder. You can go over here and it's got flux core, MIG stainless, MIG steel C100, MIG aluminum, TIG lift arc, and then down here we've got stick. It's already on what we want it to do. And this is a cool little machine, man. You can either select your material thickness, the diameter of your welding rod, what type of rod it is, but I set these things manually just because I've been welding for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. So I know how to set it up finally the way that I want for a specific piece of metal. But great machine for a beginning welder. All right, if you're going to be in grading, excavation, anything around heavy equipment, you're going to need to learn to weld or develop a really good relationship with a welder, because you're going to be needing them a lot. All right, now that you've got your ground hooked up, your work pieces ground, you know, where you're going to want to do the welds, next step is to put your electrode, your welding rod. There's several different names, but technically it is an electrode. Okay, this right here, the stinger, you squeeze it and it'll open those jaws up. Inside those jaws are, I don't know how to describe it really. See if I can get it where you can see. There are little grooves in there at different angles. One of them is straight in, one is here, and then there's one straight down the middle. You want the end of the electrode with, it's usually about 3/4 of an inch of just bare metal, is the best way I can describe it to you. This coating on the outside is called flux, and as it burns, it creates a couple of different gases that essentially displace raw air around that weld, and essentially it keeps impurities from getting into that weld from the air. So without going into too much detail, so when I'm working down like this, I always like to put the rod in at that angle right there, because it's comfortable to hold the electrode. I usually put my thumb under the handle clamp, and that way you just barely hold it. You know, you don't want to, most people when they start welding, for some reason they feel like they've got to just squeeze this thing to control it. But you can actually just hold it like this, and if you're wanting to make a really detailed, or you're in a tight spot, you can actually hold this rod. It will not shock you. The only way that this machine could shock me right now is if either my gloves were wet or I was barehanded and I touched the tip of this rod and then I touched that ground or the workpiece. And at these low of amps, I'm using about 90 amps, you're gonna feel just a little bit of a buzz or a tingle. Now, when you get up above 100 amps, you start feeling a little bit more discomfort. It's usually like a tightening of your hand. Now, I was welding one time and I was having to hug a pipe, and it was TIG welding, but it made me clamp down. But, you know, I was running some pretty high amps, so that wasn't fun. So I'm just going to, on the workpiece, I'm just going to strike and 1/1000 pull up, and that'll create a tack weld. And there's a bunch of different welding hoods. This is an auto darkening. You can post questions in the comments if you want more details. In auto darkening, it's almost like looking through sunglasses until you strike your arc, and it'll automatically go down to a 10, 11. This one goes from a 9 to a 13. So the higher amperage you run, the higher shade you need, because the brighter the arc is. So like I say, anything I don't cover you're curious about, make a comment, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. Okay, now what I'm doing as I weld is actually leaving a bit of a gap, and that way as I weld I can fill that gap, and I know for sure that I'm making a weld that's going to be thick enough to hold this. Okay, so what I'm doing here is, you can see two little tacks, One right here and one right here. Now what I can do, I'm gonna do 2 tacks about 1 inch apart, and I'm gonna do that several times all the way down this workpiece. And then that way I can move the excavator out of the way and I can just run a bead of weld connecting those 2 tacks. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and save you guys a bunch of heartache. When you get something that's twisted this badly, like this piece actually is supposed to mate up to this piece over here, don't try to twist that piece until you go ahead and make those heavy welds right through here, because if you do every one of those tacks and all that time you put in to fitting this thing up is going to be for nothing. They're going to break right loose. So let's go ahead and get those welded in. I think that'll do it. Now, obviously I'm not trying to certify to work in a nuclear power plant or for the union, but I'm not going to do multiple passes on these. I've just beefed them up enough, and I'm actually just going to leave that slag on there. The slag results from the flux and any impurities that come to the surface out of that weld. If you were going to do a root pass, which is 1 pass, and then you can do cover passes where you tie in additional passes, you would want to chip that off, and you can get a little chipping hammer at Lowe's or Ace Hardware, whatever. Both of those carry decent welding supplies. You can chip this off, and then you use a wire brush to go back and forth over it to clean it further, and then once you got nice and clean and shiny, you're ready to do additional passes. So that is all there is to basic stick welding. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Other than that, go out and get you a little welder. You can pick them up for anywhere from, like a stick welder, you can get a decent one for around $1,000. I recommend Miller, but Lincoln, you know, they make decent welders too. So go out, get your welder and some rods, have some fun with it, fix some stuff yourself and save a bunch of money. You guys have a great day.